this week's edition of New York Now, President Biden travels to Poughkeepsie. Alexis Young reports. Then, State Controller Tom DiNapoli joins us with an update on the state's finances. Then, a major chip manufacturer is laying down roots in central New York with help from the state. We'll talk about that and more with this week's panel. I'm Dan Clark, and this is New York Now.
Today, the Senate majority will pass legislation.
I will fight like hell for you every single day, like I've always done and always will.
Passing these bills on the floor, making yet another stand.
Welcome to this week's edition of New York Now. I'm Dan Clark. The largest ever single investment from a private company in upstate New York is now moving forward. Micron, a company that creates and manufactures high-tech smart chips, announced this week that it would set up shop just outside Syracuse. That's expected to bring 9,000 jobs to the area over the next 2 decades, according to the state. And it's not coming cheap. Micron says it will invest $100 billion into the facility to make that happen. The state is also offering $5.5 billion in tax credits to Micron over the next 20 years. But the company will have to hit certain jobs targets to get them. And the company could also get some help from the federal government. U.S. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer at this week's announcement.
This is our Erie Canal moment. Just as the Erie Canal fueled explosive prosperity and jobs in the 19th century, so will these investments fuel explosive jobs and prosperity in the 21st century.
And just to note that Schumer is up for re-election this year against Republican challenger Joe Pinion. But the Micron announcement was followed by another big bit of tech news out of New York this week from President Joe Biden. Reporter Alexis Young is here with more. Alexis.
That's right, Dan. President Joe Biden was in Poughkeepsie Thursday to tour IBM and give a speech on jobs in the Hudson Valley. IBM has its headquarters in Westchester, but the facility in Poughkeepsie is where the company develops and creates new computer mainframes and other tech products. The company is expected to benefit from federal legislation passed over the last year geared toward tech companies, like the CHIPS Act. The law, passed in July, created new incentives and funding streams for tech companies to boost production in the state's semiconductor and smart chip industries. Biden said Thursday that will help jumpstart the country's chip manufacturing industry.
Folks, the future of chips industry is going to be made in America. That's not hyperbole. That's a fact. It's going to be made in America. And making these chips in America is going to create new businesses for countless small manufacturers and suppliers into the supply chain that's going to thrive, all because of this law.
IBM has its own history in New York. Endicott in Broome County is known as the birthplace of IBM. The company isn't there anymore, but now plans to increase its presence in New York. IBM CEO Arvind Krishna said the company would invest $20 billion across the region over the next decade.
This investment includes breakthroughs in semiconductor technology, mainframe computers, quantum computers, and artificial intelligence. All of this will boost economic activity and create jobs.
Some Republicans, but not all, have argued against federal incentives for big tech companies, saying the U.S. shouldn't be spending more to attract and retain that industry. But Biden said that missing those investments now could put the U.S. at a disadvantage down the road.
More is going to change for the better in the next 10 years than happened in the last 40 years. We're at an inflection point in world history where the changes that are going to take place in the next 10 are going to fundamentally alter the way in which we look at the world and our place in the world. And that's not hyperbole. It's real.
The state also has incentives for tech companies, so we'll see if the industry continues to grow here in New York. Dan?
Thank you so much, Alexis. All right, we're going to circle back to the week's news in a little bit, but first, it's now been 6 months since the state legislature passed this year's state budget, and there are a lot of questions about how it's holding up in an economy that's still very much in recovery. And very few people know more about that than State Controller Tom DiNapoli, who's up for re-election next month. He's essentially the state's money manager, and his office has a close eye on the state's finances year-round. We spoke this week about the budget, his role as a check on state spending, and next month's election. State Controller Tom DiNapoli, thank you so much, as always.
Dan, great to be with you in person.
In person. I love being in person. It makes everything easier and better. So we are about 6 months after the state budget was passed in April. You are the state's money manager. In that time, we're halfway through the fiscal year of the state. How are we doing right now in terms of finances?
The budget is holding together, and keep in mind, Division of Budget lowered the projections as to what revenue would be. But in our last month's cash report, we're still up by about $157 million. So it's still a bit higher than anticipated. But I think the challenge is it's a very uncertain time. You see how poorly the stock market's been performing, in recent weeks. So I think for the rest of the year, we need to be cautious. I think we need to be cautious in our personal lives as far as spending, and certainly for the state as well. Be mindful that as secure as it seems right now, it might be very different 6 months from now. Already we're anticipating a budget gap, next year at around $310 million. It's possible those numbers will grow, again, depending on how it looks a month or two from now as we get into the fall.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the budget gap. So $310 million is a lot of money, but in the context of the state budget, it's not that much money. The state budget is $220 billion. Yeah. That being said, are we prepared to handle closing that gap right now financially?
Well, first of all, we're in better shape because we're finally building up the reserves, which I think you and I have talked about in the past. And New York's done a very poor job of that historically, and it's something we've recommended in all of our budget reports, and certainly the voice of the controller has always been, we're not well prepared for an economic downturn. So I'm very pleased that this governor and this legislature did make a commitment to significantly boost our rainy day reserve, so we have that cushion. I would also say on the scale, as you point out, Dan, of the size of our state budget, $310 million gap can be managed even without going to the reserves. There are other ways to make decisions about spending. The challenge is going to be if that number grows, number one. Number two, we have to be mindful that the federal money that's helped us tremendously, thanks to Senator Schumer and the Biden administration, our congressional delegation, that money will be winding down. And if the economy is not picking up, there are many programs that people support, believe in. There were big bets made this year, investments, I should say, in education and healthcare, childcare. I don't think folks are going to want to see that spending curtailed because much of that is very important to continue the recovery, to get more people back into the workforce. So I think the challenge in next year's budget is going to be whatever the size of the gap is, and we hope it'll be a modest one. How do we make decisions about spending that will keep us on a sustainable path of budget balance in the context of a problematic economy and federal support that obviously is winding down? So I think it's going to be a challenging budget debate next year, and of course we have elections. So depending on who the players are, will there be any changes? Might that impact that whole process? So, I think it's going to be a very interesting year next year in Albany.
Speaking of the budget, historically, this previous governor, Governor Andrew Cuomo, had used the budget to kind of curtail some of your oversight powers early in his administration. And now there is legislation that is before this governor, Governor Kathy Hochul, that would codify that oversight back into law. There was an agreement between you and the governor's office to bring it back, but now this is, putting it in stone. She is deciding to sign that bill in the next couple of months. If she doesn't sign the bill, what do you think the consequences of that are?
Well, in terms of immediate consequences, because we do have that memorandum of understanding, which, just in terms of context, you're right, the previous governor, this was a priority for him, all under the umbrella of increasing efficiency, but we're actually very efficient in turning around contracts. It compromised independent oversight, which I think is important to the integrity of a procurement process, a contracting process, important to ensure best value for taxpayers. And it was done not unilaterally. The legislature approved it. We think it's very important for the future. It's not about me. It's about controllers forever to restore this. We've seen too many problems of perhaps some decisions that weren't the best ones. We've seen some cases of corruption. And while no system is perfect, having an additional set of eyes to look at these kinds of transactions, I think, is very important. So I think it's key for the governor to sign it. I've been very pleased not only that the legislature overwhelmingly voted in favor of it, but we're seeing just the past couple of weeks, editorials are coming out very strongly in favor of this. So I'm hopeful. I know Governor Hochul has made a commitment to doing things differently and have a different atmosphere. I think this legislation, signing it would be the strongest signal that the governor could put out there that, in fact, the page has been turned and this is an administration that's doing things differently and is open to the kind of accountability that is there to serve the taxpayers.
You know, we had a similar situation during the pandemic where some of your oversight powers were suspended. At the time, Governor Andrew Cuomo had said it was because we had to respond to the pandemic quickly. We didn't have time to go through the comptroller's oversight process, which you say is very fast. Do you think that was a mistake? There are now claims that that governor and this governor may have made decisions that were tied to campaign donors, whether intentionally or not. But do you think that was a mistake to suspend them?
Well, I mean, I think it's a fair question as to how long should the emergency period have been in place. You know, it's always easy to look backwards. You know, when COVID first hit, it really was a crisis. I mean, desperate for ventilators and personal protective equipment. I mean, I would still argue, because there are always some situations where we still have contract oversight. When it's an emergency situation, we work closely with the agency that's putting a contract for it to turn around, sometimes within a day. You know, so I think even at the peak of the emergency, we could have added value again. You know, by having that authority there. You know, some questions have been raised about certain contracts and vendors who got a contract approval that gave money, political money. You know, a couple of thoughts on that. First of all, in New York State, it is not illegal for a contractor or a vendor to make a political contribution. It just isn't, right? So you look at any number of elected officials, there's a lot of focus right now on the governor, but you could go across the state and look at mayors, county executives, a lot of other folks, and I'm sure you'll find many people doing donations that are involved with procurements, right, at every level of government. I think, you know, and so unless you have a clear, we got this contract or this payment because of the contribution, which is very hard to prove.
A clear quid pro quo.
Quid pro quo, as is said, and there are all kinds of court rulings on that. What I really think the answer is, I think it's a valid concern. The appearance is as important as anything else, right? There is legislation pending, reform legislation, that would say that during a procurement period, if you're participating in that procurement or that bid, you're not allowed to give a campaign contribution. And if you receive that, if you win the award and you get the contract, 6 months after that, you can't give. And we could argue about what the right time frame is, but I think it would be beneficial, whether it's 90 days, 6 months, whatever, where you're precluded from making contributions. I just think it would just be a more credible way of doing all this.
Now, speaking of political season, you're running for another term as state controller. It would be another 4 years. Wondering if you have anything that you want to do in those next 4 years, any big goals. I know you're working on divesting the pension fund, making it carbon zero by 2040.
Yeah.
Do you have anything else on your plate?
Well, I mean, fully implementing our climate action plan with the pension fund is certainly something that's very important to me. I think I would also say that the recovery is not complete here in New York. So continuing to monitor trends, giving information to people about, you know, not only the state, but each region about how we're performing, what sectors of the economy are doing better. I think that's an area we want to continue to focus on. I think also there are still many people that are really hurting during this time, and I think doing more reports and audits to look at issues like food insecurity, that's a big issue out there.
Huge.
Housing affordability. We've done reports, perhaps we'll do more on broadband access, internet access across the state. I think we need to have more thoughtful discussion about all these issues that are complex, and it needs to be presented in a way that's not politicized. So I would really hope to position our office even more forcefully or more credibly than we've done in the past as a source of helpful information to guide us through this challenging time. So I guess, Dan, it's more of the same, but tailoring it to the times we're going through.
Is there anything that you would like, I know you say you're not a policy shop, but is there anything that you would like to see the legislature do to expand the powers of your office? Your opponent's main criticism of you has been that you haven't done enough to combat corruption, but I know that there are limited things that you can do there. Do you want more power?
Well, I would say, first of all, on the corruption front, we have elevated the role of our investigative unit. We work with the AG's office and DA's and U.S. Attorney's offices. So, over the past, over the decade now, we've been involved with cases that have resulted in over 200 arrests of elected officials, appointed officials, heads of nonprofits managing public money, and we've gotten back now about over $82 million in restitution. So we're actually very involved in the corruption issue. And sometimes our audits, uncover that. Look, would I like to see some of our audits, when we make recommendations, those recommendations actually be enforced or followed? Because they're not right now. We make a recommendation, and the entity that we audit, a state agency, a local government, a school district, they could say, great, we'll implement it, or they could say,
no thanks.
No thanks, we're not doing that. And we have no ability other than shining a light and hoping that citizens and the press, back up what we're saying and call these entities accountable to deal with what we recommend. Should there perhaps be a bit more teeth where they might be compelled to respond to our audits in a way that is not dismissive? I'm not sure quite how you'd word it, but I guess I would say if we could strengthen the impact that our audits could have, I think that would be helpful. But I think a criticism that we're not on top of the issue of corruption is just wrong. But unfortunately, there's a lot of it going on. And that's why we have DAs in 62 counties, and we have U.S. attorneys across the state. We have an attorney general, we have FBI, we have state police. We're not going to substitute that law enforcement role, but we are going to complement it. And we've been really stepping up for many years now to be a partner with law enforcement.
Right. A lot of moving parts, a lot of interesting stuff. Controller Tom DiNapoli, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan.
And we'll be speaking with DiNapoli's challenger, Republican Paul Rodriguez, on next week's show. But moving along now to some big news from the State Department of Labor over the past week. First, the minimum wage in upstate New York will be going up at the start of next year. The new minimum wage north of Westchester County will be $14.20, up from $13.20. And second, we got a decision on the question of overtime for farm workers. The state has accepted a recommendation from a state wage board that will require overtime pay for farm workers after 40 hours in a week. That's down from the current 60 hours, and it'll be phased in over 10 years. Leaders from the state's farming industry have said the change will force more farms to scale back operations or close. The state has defended the decision, saying new tax credits passed in this year's state budget will cover the added costs. Here's what State Labor Commissioner Roberta Reardon told New York Now this week in Buffalo.
Everybody else got 40 hours and then overtime, and we just had to find some way to equalize that system. But we do think the long timeline will give the farmers time to adjust and figure out how they want to staff and operate their farms.
The first round will lower the overtime threshold for farm workers to 54 hours in 2024. Let's circle back now to the news of the week with this week's panel. It's Keisha Kluge from Bloomberg Government. Thank you for being here, Keisha.
Thanks for having me.
Happy to have you. So a bit of news that I want to start on is on Thursday, a federal judge struck down part of New York's new concealed carry gun law. It will take effect in 3 days and may not even take effect because the state says they're going to appeal it, but I'll let you talk about that. But he struck down a bunch of different things, most notably, I think, probably some sensitive locations where we were banning guns, museums, theaters, Times Square, libraries, places that serve alcohol, places that offer services to children. This was really a key crux, I think, to the gun law, because what happened with the Supreme Court, not to talk for this entire segment, but what happened with the Supreme Court is they threw out the state's gun laws. So now New York tried to create this new model, and now it's not working out so well. So what's next?
Definitely. Well, they created this new model, which had, like you said, an extensive list of places, which basically said, I think even Kathy Hochul herself said it would apply to everywhere, but like maybe some sidewalks. So the judge kind of took issue with that, and he also took issue with you have to have an in-person interview to get a permit, which can create a backlog and would therefore violate the Second Amendment, a right to bear arms. And then he also added a line in self-defense. So when they're considering you for a permit, they have to say, will you cause harm with said gun? And he said, well, if you're doing self-defense, you may cause harm. So he added that line in self-defense. So, but the interesting thing is he knew that the Democrats essentially in the state were going to appeal that. And so he put in this temporary restriction for 3 days, allowing them to appeal it and kind of get the higher courts, thoughts on the matter and then go back with it. So we're really kind of in limbo at this point. We'll have to see what the higher court says, and then it could go back to him, and they could have to make some changes to the law next session, which I think a lot of the Democrats are running on this issue in November. And so that causes a little bit of friction there.
I wonder what happens with this lawsuit in the long term. I mean, it's not out of the realm of possibilities that this law ends up at the U.S. Supreme Court again. And then what if they strike it down? Then the state is back to the drawing board, essentially.
Definitely. And that's kind of the risk they took. I mean, I think no one really knew how far you can go with the law before the Supreme Court would knock it down again. So I think they really took a shot. And, the people I spoke to said they were speaking to constitutional lawyers and trying to get the best advice on this legally. So we'll really have to see where the court goes. Now, it also depends on where which court they can pick which court they want to go to, and they did choose a court in a very conservative area. So I don't know, maybe their appeal will be elsewhere. We'll have to see.
I did want to touch on the Micron announcement, but I think I want to skip that actually and go straight to the Court of Appeals. You had a story this week, kind of an update on where the search for the new chief judge is. And this is just, it's so important to highlight because this is the person who is the head of the state judiciary. They control the state's courts. They also sit at the top of the State Court of Appeals, the state's highest court. So a lot of power. What's going on with that search?
Definitely. So the application process closed at the end of August. And because the former judge, Janet DeFiore, put in her resignation early. So typically you would retire either the year you turn 70 or right before you turn 70, depending on the timing. And the commission that's charged with looking for your replacement would have a little bit more time to at least solicit applications and, really get the best cream of the crop applying. Now, they didn't have time to do that, so they just, solicited what they could, got the applications. Moving forward, they do background checks. They give them, I think it was like a 9-page questionnaire, so a much lengthier questionnaire. Why would you want to be judged? What would you do in the position? That sort of thing. And then they have until actually the week of Thanksgiving, so that'll be interesting, to give 7 nominees to the governor. The governor has between 15 and 30 days to choose her appointee, and then that goes to the state senate for either confirmation or they kick it back, and we'll see what happens. So we can expect a new judge probably in January or so. But the kind of side part of this is that there's calls for a more diverse judge because it is in that top court. We're a very diverse state. They're looking for someone, a lot of progressives are looking for someone who's not a prosecutor. And typically we've seen these judges coming from, prosecutor backgrounds, big law firms, and they want to kind of change that and have this, more diverse person. But there's a shortened time frame to find that person. So it's a little bit of a challenge for the court. And they've also had to pick several judges in the last few years. It's been a very tumultuous time just with, there's been deaths, there's been early retirements. So this commission's kind of been working on overtime.
How can this person change the state court system and the Court of Appeals, Keisha? Like, this person has tremendous power, but obviously whoever comes in is going to kind of set the tone from the top down. Definitely,
definitely. And Janet DeFiore was a very interesting person because she was a Republican, turned Democrat almost right before she was picked for this by Governor Cuomo, former Governor Cuomo. And so she had sort of a conservative effect on the court. So I think progressives are hoping for someone that has more of a liberal effect on the court. And lawmakers, too. I spoke to head of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Senator Brad Hoylman, and he said, when we pass laws, we would like them to stand. And that is what the Court of Appeals is there for. Things like the gun law would go up this one in particular went to federal court, but sometimes they can go to the Court of Appeals. So they're having an effect on, state law, state policies, and even things like vaccination requirements. At the same time, not only are they in charge of the legal decisions, but they're also in charge of a $3 billion court budget. They have, I think it's 1,300 judges and 15,000 employees. So you're talking about a pretty wide range. So some of the commission members were saying they're also looking for someone with administrative skills as well.
That's interesting. Well, you kind of need it. I mean, you're running that branch of government. I would hope that you have some sort of management experience.
Definitely, definitely.
But that's all we have time for. Keisha Kluge from Bloomberg Government, thank you as always. And don't forget that you can get more news from around New York on our website anytime. That's at nynow.org. Thanks for watching this week's New York Now. Have a great week and be well.
Funding for New York Now is provided by WNET.